Why was everyone laughing except her? The officers' club was bright with champagne light, voices spilling into each other in waves of pride and arrogance. A celebration, at least that's what the invitations had promised. A night where newly minted lieutenants, polished shoes still stiff with factory leather, would toast their ascension into the ranks of leadership. But not every laugh in the room was honest. Some were nervous, brittle things that cracked like glass. Some were masks worn by those too junior to resist the tide. And one laugh, sharper than the rest, louder, designed to cut, carried a weight that pressed down on the air. Honestly, I don't know why we even allow senior NCOs and warrants at an officer's promotion party. It just lowers the tone. The words came from Lieutenant Derek Vance. His new bars gleamed like fresh paint, his ego inflated beyond the walls of the club. He spoke as though the room existed only to echo him. The crowd tittered, some laughed because they thought they had to, others didn't laugh at all. Their silence wasn't respect, it was weariness. They'd seen his type before. And there, standing at the back of the room, a glass of water in her hand, was the woman his insult was aimed at. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even shift her gaze from the middle distance. She just lifted the glass to her lips. The hand that held it was steady like granite, as though no insult could disturb her balance. To most, it seemed she was ignoring him. To Commander Elias Thorne, watching quietly from the balcony above, it was something else. He saw the way her weight balanced, the way her shoulders sat, the imperceptible readiness in her posture. It was a stance he hadn't seen in years. The kind that only appeared when a storm was close, when a woman had lived long enough to understand that silence can be more powerful than rage. He knew that silence. It was the calm before terrible, beautiful competence. Lieutenant Vance, of course, saw none of this. He saw only what his arrogance allowed. A woman older than the rest, her uniform plain, her collar marked by an insignia he didn't recognize, a dark block with silver lines that meant nothing to him. Not a lieutenant's bar, not a captain's double. Something strange, something outside his narrow education. He filed it away as unimportant. He mistook solitude for exclusion, quiet for weakness, stillness for submission. And so he swaggered closer, his little group of lieutenants orbiting him like pilot fish. He raised his glass, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I mean seriously," he said, "what do you even do? Fix the comms, calibrate the coffee machines. This is a night for leaders, for decision makers, not support staff." The smirk that followed wasn't earned. It was practiced, lifted from movies, the kind of gesture a boy thought a man would make. The woman, Chief Warrant Officer 5 Eva Rostova, finished her sip of water. She placed the glass on the table beside her. The sound was soft, but it echoed in the room as though the air itself wanted silence. Her eyes moved at last. Winter blue, steady, they locked onto Vance, and in them was nothing, no anger, no indignation, just emptiness. It was worse than contempt. It was worse than rage. It said, "You're not a threat. You're not a concern. You're not even on my radar." That was a language Vance didn't understand. And because he didn't understand it, he felt it. A flush of humiliation rising hot in his cheeks. He stepped forward, his hand beginning to lift. Not to strike, no, he wouldn't dare, not in public. But enough to invade, enough to jab a finger, enough to pat a shoulder with that condescending touch meant to assert dominance. What he wanted was simple. He wanted her to flinch. He needed to see her break, because if she didn't, then what did that say about him? But his hand never landed. Because that's when the sirens began. The base-wide emergency klaxon ripped through the air like a blade. Red lights stuttered across the walls, painting the party in the glow of danger. The champagne laughter evaporated, replaced by shouts, by radios crackling, by the rising chaos of crisis. This was no drill. Everyone knew it instantly. The sound wasn't routine. It was the cry of something breaking, something expensive, something deadly. The new lieutenants scrambled. their voices rising with questions they didn't know how to answer. Vance spun in the noise, shouting orders that went nowhere. His voice cracked half an octave higher as he barked nonsense at no one in particular. "What's the status? Somebody get me a report. What's happening?" Panic disguised as authority. And in the middle of it all, Eva Rostova moved. Not in panic, not with noise, but with the calmness of inevitability. Her stillness had never been passivity, it had been readiness. And now, while others scrambled, she simply stepped into motion. She turned away from Vance, away from his noise, toward the monitors that had once been projecting celebratory slides. Now they glowed with telemetry, cascading streams of numbers and symbols. To most, it was gibberish. To her, it was a story. And the story was a tragedy. The X-7 Ghost Hawk, the base's crown jewel, a reconnaissance drone worth millions, carrying intelligence worth more than its weight in gold, was in freefall. Its control surfaces had failed completely. Dead stick, full tanks, classified cargo, and its trajectory, a red line across the screen pointing straight toward the small town beyond the base perimeter. Havenwood, families, schools, people who had no idea what was about to come down from the sky. Voices on the radio cracked, urgent, strained. Control operators cycling through protocols, shouting into the void. But the machine wasn't listening. It was deaf, broken, an unguided missile. And while the room dissolved into chaos, she walked. Each step even, deliberate, carving through the frantic crowd like a ship through water. Vance noticed her then, saw her eyes locked on the falling numbers, and his panic twisted into arrogance again. "Get out of the way, warrant officer," he snapped, desperate for control. "This is officer business. Let the real pilots handle it." But his words didn't reach her. They couldn't. She was already past him, already inside the story unfolding on the screen. She had seen enough. She knew what was happening, and she knew what had to be done. Her fingers brushed across the console in the corner, a station built for VIP coordination, rarely used, forgotten by most. But to her, it was a doorway. Her movements were precise, her keystrokes fluid, economical, not frantic, not wasted. And as she worked, the noise of the room dimmed. The shouts, the alarms, even Vance's bluster became a distant hum. Around her formed a bubble of pure focus. Commander Thorne leaned forward from the balcony, his eyes narrowing. He had seen this before. That stillness, that certainty, the posture of someone who knew the machine better than anyone else alive. And yet no one else in the room understood. Not yet. "What in God's name is she doing?" Vance muttered, his fear bleeding through the sneer. No one answered, because despite their confusion, no one dared interrupt her. Her voice came then, clear, calm, a surgeon's scalpel through the chaos. "Tower, this is Rostova. Patch me into the Ghost Hawk's maintenance subsystem. Direct line, propulsion and ballast control." The operators hesitated. That channel was restricted, ground use only. It wasn't supposed to be used in flight. But then she said the words that froze them. "Override authorization, 9 Sigma Tango 7. A pause, a silence like a held breath. That code wasn't supposed to exist outside the highest levels. Only a handful of people in the world could have it. And she had it. On the screen, the flood of numbers shifted, became raw code. The drone's digital soul laid bare. She wasn't trying to fly it. She was speaking directly to it. And as her fingers moved faster, the red line on the map bent, just a fraction, just a single pixel east. Impossible. A dead stick doesn't change its path. Physics doesn't bend. And yet, Thorne saw it, and for the first time in years he felt a chill of awe. Because this wasn't luck, this wasn't chance, this was her. The quiet woman with winter eyes, the one who had taken the insult without flinching. The one none of them understood. She wasn't done. Not even close. How do you tell when silence carries more authority than rank? The room was a storm of voices. Officers shouting into radios, aides running in circles with clipboards, commanders barking half-orders no one had time to obey. 100 different responses, none of them effective. But Eva Rostova sat in the eye of the storm. Her fingers moved across the console with the certainty of someone not searching, but remembering. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't trial and error. It was a conversation with a machine she seemed to know more intimately than the rest of them knew their own breathing. The Ghost Hawk's telemetry scrolled across the screen, cascading lines of failures, altitude bleeding fast, warnings read with urgency. To most, it was noise. To her, it was a language. She read it like sheet music, each line a note in a melody only she could hear. She was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. "Get her away from that terminal," Vance barked, his face pale but his tone sharp. "She'll make it worse." But no one moved. Even the younger officers who orbited his arrogance minutes ago froze, caught in the gravitational pull of her composure. Something in her presence held them back, the quiet authority of someone who had faced worse than this, someone who didn't panic because panic was wasted energy. Her voice cut in again, calm, level, absolute. "Tower, route propulsion subsystems to my console. Confirm ballast tank feed override." A voice crackled back, the strain in it obvious. "Ma'am, that channel's not for flight control." "Do it now." No raised tone, no anger, just finality. The room felt it. This wasn't a request, it was inevitability. And then the data shifted. The screen bled into raw code, the ghostly bones of the drone's inner functions. No autopilot, no control surfaces, just the raw machinery of gravity and fuel. Commander Thorne's heart tightened in his chest. He had seen countless crises in his career, some survived, some not. But he had never seen anyone move like this. She wasn't flying it, she was teaching it how to fall. On the wall display, the red line tracing the drone's descent bent by a fraction eastward, only a sliver, but enough to make every officer in the room gasp. "It's not possible," someone whispered. And yet there it was. The immutable path of physics had shifted, a miracle born not of luck but of keystrokes. Rostova's expression didn't change. Her eyes reflected the green glow of the code, steady and calculating. She wasn't celebrating the deviation. She wasn't even relieved. She was still working, still chasing seconds from the sky. Vance clung to his arrogance like a drowning man clings to driftwood. "This is insanity. She's a mechanic, not a pilot. She can't." But his words faltered. No one was listening. Because the line bent again. This time more noticeably. The red arc no longer pointed at Havenwood's church steeple. It edged toward the fields beyond town, still deadly, still catastrophic, but no longer a direct strike on civilians. And she wasn't stopping. Her fingers were a blur, her mind years ahead of the numbers. She rerouted fuel, dumping weight from one wing to the other, shifting the center of gravity by fractions of inches. She fired thrusters designed for the stratosphere in frantic, precise bursts. She didn't fight gravity. She negotiated with it, coaxing it sideways, foot by painful foot. The drone streaked past the panoramic windows of the club, a dark silhouette against the dying sky. Its engines were silent, its descent inevitable. Every officer in the room could see it now, not just on the map, not just in numbers, but with their own eyes. And still she worked. Each keystroke a heartbeat, each command a prayer. Her lips parted just slightly, whispering the numbers under her breath, the language of machines. For a moment, even the alarms seemed to quiet, as though the base itself was holding its breath. Vance's face twisted. His confidence was breaking, cracking under the weight of what he couldn't understand. If she succeeded, everything he believed about rank and power would collapse. He needed her to fail. But she wasn't failing. The red line bent again, this time carving away from Havenwood altogether. It pointed now toward the marshlands on the far side of the base, an emergency crash zone, wide and empty. "Dear God," someone whispered. On the console, the last sequence of commands fell into place. She vented the remaining fuel, bleeding the fire risk into the cold atmosphere. She deployed the landing gear, not to land but to drag, to spoil the last of the descent. And then the drone hit. Not an explosion, not the fireball everyone braced for. Just a heavy final thud. Silence fell. A silence heavier than any alarm, deeper than any chaos. The Ghost Hawk was down, damaged but intact, its cargo safe, its fuel gone, its path diverted, Havenwood untouched. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the electronics. Then the shouts from the tower crackled through the speakers, disbelief, relief, voices cheering through static. The officers' club stood frozen, every eye turned to her. Eva Rostova sat back from the console, her hands still, her breath steady. She began logging out, her motions unhurried, almost dismissive, as though she had simply finished her shift. To her, the crisis was over, the problem was solved. To everyone else, the world had just shifted. Vance's mouth hung open, pale, trembling. He had spent the night trying to make her flinch. Now it was he who shook, stripped of every illusion. And then came the footsteps. Commander Thorne descended the stairs, each step deliberate, heavy with meaning. The officers parted before him, silent, their eyes darting between their commander and the woman who had just saved a town. Thorne's gaze never wavered. He didn't look at the console, didn't glance at the drone's telemetry. He walked straight to her, stopping 3 feet away. For a moment he said nothing, his eyes locked with hers, a silent exchange, recognition, respect, memory. And then his voice, low but cutting through the room like steel. "Captain, pull up the service record for Chief Warrant Officer 5 Eva Rostova, full file, unredacted." The aide blinked, stammered. "Sir, her file, parts of it are classified above clearance." "I'm aware." The command was final. Keystrokes filled the silence. Then the projector flickered, the slideshow of smiling lieutenants replaced by stark black text, a personnel file. The first line made the room stir. Name Eva Rostova, rank Chief Warrant Officer 5. A CW-5, a unicorn, a rank so rare most officers would retire without ever seeing one in person. The file scrolled. Units, assignments, decorations, hours in experimental aircraft, a Distinguished Service Cross, a Silver Star, a Flying Cross. The air seemed to thicken. And then the final revelation. Lead Design Engineer and Chief Test Pilot, Project Ghost Hawk X7. The drone she had just saved, the machine no one else could touch. She hadn't just flown it, she had created it. The override code she used wasn't borrowed, she had written it. The silence deepened, every officer staring at the truth on the screen. And Thorne, the commander who had seen more than most men dared dream, straightened his back, brought his hand to his brow, and gave her the kind of salute reserved for the highest of honors. Slow, formal, absolute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady iron, "on behalf of this entire installation, thank you." The words struck the air like a gavel. In that moment, the hierarchy of the room changed forever. How do you measure the weight of silence after a miracle? The red line on the screen had stopped, ending in a harmless green circle. The Ghost Hawk was down, Havenwood was safe, and yet no one in the officers' club moved. The only sound was the faint hum of electronics and the shuffling of Commander Thorne's boots as he lowered his salute. His hand fell back to his side, but the gesture lingered, carved into the air like an inscription on stone. Every officer in the room felt it. A commander of Thorne's stature, a man who never wasted words or movements, had saluted a warrant officer, not casually, not politely, formally, deliberately, with reverence. For some, it was an honor beyond comprehension. For others, it was a rebuke that cut deeper than any reprimand. Eva Rostova herself seemed almost apart from it. She didn't bask in the recognition. She didn't even acknowledge the salute in return. She simply continued logging out of the console, her motions efficient, methodical, as if closing the final page of a book only she had been able to read. The celebration that had filled the club earlier had dissolved completely. The champagne was warm. The music had stopped. The lieutenants who minutes ago strutted and joked now stood pale and still, their laughter curdled into shame. And Lieutenant Derek Vance. His face was ashen. His mouth worked soundlessly, a man choking on his own pride. He had insulted her, diminished her, tried to make her flinch. And now, in front of everyone, his ignorance was carved into the record like a scar. The file still glowed on the screen, each line of text a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. Flight hours that dwarfed anything he could imagine. Decorations he hadn't even known the names of. Missions marked, classified, that spoke of worlds he would never enter. And the final line, lead engineer, lead test pilot, Project Ghost Hawk X7. The very machine they had just watched her wrestle from the sky. He wanted to deny it, wanted to cling to his narrative that she was just a mechanic, just support. But the truth was undeniable. She hadn't merely saved the drone. She had written it. The silence broke at last, but not with words. It broke with the sound of one man's boots. Commander Thorne turned, his gaze sweeping the room like a blade. His eyes found Vance and pinned him in place. "Lieutenant," Thorne said, his voice low but carrying, "you've made a mistake tonight." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The weight in them was heavier than any punishment. You didn't just disrespect a warrant officer. You disrespected an institution. You mistook a legend for a technician. You let arrogance blind you to reality. And in doing so, you revealed the worst flaw an officer can have. The room felt the words as much as heard them. Thorne's hand lifted, a single finger pointing at Vance, not with anger, but with the steady finality of judgment. You insulted not her rank. You insulted her character, and you failed to see what was right in front of you. Vance's chest tightened. His throat closed. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but no words came, because there was nothing left to say. The other officers watched, their shame mingling with relief. Relief that it was him, not them. Relief that they hadn't been the ones to speak the words, but their eyes told the truth. They all shared in the guilt. They had all laughed. And Thorne's voice carried that truth like a hammer. Let this be a lesson for every one of you. Rank is not the measure of worth. Competence is. Character is. And tonight, you have all been reminded of it. No one breathed. Rostova finished logging out. She stood, her posture calm, her eyes unreadable. She offered no speech, no vindication. She didn't need to. The room itself was her proof. Then she walked past them. No hurry, no triumph, just quiet inevitability. She left the club as though she had never been there. But the silence she left behind stayed. It lingered long after the alarm stopped, long after the monitors were shut down, long after the club emptied. It lingered in the walkways, in the hangars, in the barracks. A silence heavy with the realization that they had witnessed something they would tell and retell for years. The story spread, not like gossip, but like scripture. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't embellished. It was whispered, reverent, each retelling carrying the same weight as the night itself. In the hangars, master sergeants told young airmen, "Listen to the quiet ones, the ones who don't need to prove anything. They're the ones you should fear under fire." In the barracks, squad leaders warned recruits, "Never assume you know who stands before you. Respect everyone, or you might find yourself in the shadow of someone who outranks all of us without needing the bars." And in the officer clubs of other bases, pilots leaned across tables and said, "Did you hear what happened at Havenwood? About the woman in row 9? They called her different things, a ghost, a legend, a myth in plain sight. but the meaning was always the same. She had become more than a soldier. She had become a story. And Vance. For him, the aftermath was its own kind of battlefield. Commander Thorne, in his wisdom, didn't confine him, didn't strip him of rank. That would have been too simple. Instead, he left him to face the world he had mocked. Every morning, Vance walked past warrant officers and NCOs whose faces told the truth without a word. Not anger, not revenge, just knowing. The kind of knowing that cut deeper than accusations. His clique of lieutenants dissolved, peeling away one by one. No one wanted to stand beside him now. No one wanted to be remembered as the ones who had laughed. He was alone, an island made of his own arrogance. And the silence judged him more than any court-martial could. The humbling was slow, brutal, necessary. It began with a pen. Commander Thorne ordered him to write an apology, not typed, not emailed, handwritten, 1,000 words. He was to write in his own hand the ways he had failed, his arrogance, his ignorance, his disrespect. He wrote it once, then Thorne tore it up, too shallow. He wrote it again. And again. Until the words weren't performance anymore, until they hurt, until he believed them. And then came the day of the base-wide formation. Thousands of personnel assembled in ranks, the sun hot on their shoulders, the flags snapping in the wind. Lieutenant Vance stood at the podium, his face pale, his hands shaking. In his grip was the letter, his handwriting scrawled across the page. And in a voice stripped bare of arrogance, he read. He read of his ignorance, his prejudice, his failure as an officer. He read of how he disrespected not just one woman but an entire corps. He read of his blindness, his pride, and his shame. The crowd listened, silent, some with contempt, some with pity. When he finished, the silence stayed. And though it broke him, it also began to rebuild him. Because humility, once learned, doesn't fade. Vance's redemption began there, not with words but with actions. He was seen in the motor pool, not shouting orders but asking questions. He was seen in the comms shop, not pretending to know, but listening to warrant officers explain uplinks. He learned to close his mouth, to open his ears. He discovered that leadership wasn't found in textbooks or ceremonies, but in the grease-stained hands of men and women who had lived longer, seen more, and earned their wisdom in silence. His journey had only just begun, but for the first time it was the right one. And while he struggled through humility, Eva Rostova went back to work. Not basking in legend, not sitting for interviews. She was found in the hangar, sleeves rolled, hands covered in hydraulic fluid, pointing out a fracture in the Ghost Hawk's wing spar to a young mechanic. When a group of wide-eyed pilots gathered, calling her a hero, she shook her head. "I'm not a hero," she said, voice calm, unshaken. "I was doing my job." And then, without ceremony, she returned to her work. Because that was who she was. Not a story, not a myth, not a rank. A professional. And for her, that was enough. Why do some stories burn out quickly, while others seep into the very ground they happen on? The night of the officers' club did not vanish with the morning sun. It stayed, heavy in the air, the way smoke lingers long after the fire has gone cold. There were no official press releases, no medals pinned in public, no ceremony with cameras and speeches. That wasn't how this story spread. Instead, it traveled like tidewater, quiet, relentless, irresistible. In the hangars, grizzled master sergeants stripped down turbines while telling young mechanics, "Remember the quiet ones. Remember the woman who saved a town without raising her voice. Respect is earned, not shouted." In the barracks, squad leaders whispered the cautionary version. "Don't assume you know the worth of the person beside you. Don't mistake stillness for weakness, or you'll end up like Vance." And in the officer clubs of other bases, pilots leaned across tables in low tones. "Did you hear about Havenwood? The drone, the crash, the warrant officer who bent physics itself. It wasn't gossip, it wasn't rumor, it was parable. And the parable carried a sting. Because it wasn't just about Eva Rostova. It was about the arrogance of those who laughed, about the blindness of officers too enamored with their own reflection to see what stood before them. For Lieutenant Derek Vance, the aftermath became a crucible. Commander Thorne had chosen his punishment with precision. No stripes torn away, no reduction in rank. That would have been easy. Instead, Vance was left to live under the shadow of his own humiliation. Everywhere he walked, eyes followed, not mocking, not openly scornful, worse than that, knowing. The warrant officers he once dismissed didn't sneer at him. They didn't gloat. They didn't even confront him. They simply looked at him, a glance that said, "We know who you are now, and so do you." Silence was his punishment. It followed him through the mess hall, down the flight line, into every briefing room. It was heavier than confinement, harsher than demotion. His clique of young lieutenants dissolved. One by one they drifted away, eager not to be remembered as the ones who laughed with him. He was left alone, an island built on arrogance, stripped down to stone. But isolation has a way of stripping a man to the core. The humbling began. It was slow, almost imperceptible, a seed cracking beneath soil. At first it was obedience. Thorne ordered him to write an apology by hand, 1,000 words, not typed, not dictated, written. He scrawled it in frustration. Thorne tore it up. He wrote it again with anger. Thorne tore that one up too. The third time the words faltered. The pen slowed, the arrogance bled away. By the fifth draft, his hand shook not from rage but from something else, recognition, shame. And by the seventh, the words finally cut him, finally reached him, finally became true. When he read it aloud at the next base-wide formation, thousands of personnel standing in ranks beneath a pale sky, his voice trembled, not with defiance but with something stripped bare. He apologized not just to Chief Warrant Officer Rostova, who was not even present, but to the entire warrant officer and NCO Corps. He admitted ignorance, admitted arrogance, admitted that in his blindness he had failed as an officer. The silence that followed was harsher than applause, heavier than boos. And yet, for the first time, it was not a silence meant to punish him. It was a silence that might, someday, let him rebuild. He stepped down from the podium with his pride shattered, but his path, finally, set straight. He was seen differently after that, not forgiven, not yet, but changed. He began showing up where no officer usually did. In the motor pool, leaning over transmissions with grease on his hands, asking master gunnery sergeants how to diagnose leaks. In the comms shop, not barking orders but listening, actually listening, as warrant officers explained uplinks and systems he barely understood. He learned to keep his mouth closed, learned to open his ears, learned that leadership wasn't standing above others but standing among them. His redemption was slow, painful, real. And while Vance carried his burden, Eva Rostova carried none of it. To her, the night at the officers' club was already behind her. She returned to her work as if nothing had happened. In the hangar the next morning, her sleeves were rolled, her hands covered in hydraulic fluid as she pointed out a fracture on the Ghost Hawk's wing spar to a young mechanic. When pilots, wide-eyed and brimming with awe, approached her with words like hero and legend, she barely looked up. "I'm not a hero," she said simply. "I was doing my job. The system worked as designed. The failure was controlled." And then she bent back to her work. Her humility was not false, not rehearsed. It was simply who she was. Recognition meant nothing to her. Awards meant less. What mattered were the details, the problems, the work itself. And yet outside her hangar, her legend grew. The marshland where the Ghost Hawk had crash-landed was christened informally as Rostova's Point. Pilots flying overhead dipped their wings in silent salute. No one made it official. They didn't need to. The gesture was enough. Within weeks, the phrase, "Don't pull a Vance," entered the base's language. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel. It was simple shorthand, a reminder whispered when a young officer spoke too loudly, assumed too much, dismissed someone too quickly. "Don't pull a Vance." The phrase spread faster than the story itself. And with it came change. Something shifted in the culture of Havenwood, slowly, then all at once. Where once officers and enlisted had been separated by invisible walls, conversations began to cross those barriers. A lieutenant at the club asking a first sergeant about maintenance. A captain in the mess hall listening quietly as a warrant explained a new system. Mutual respect took root, not everywhere, not all at once, but enough that the air felt different. Commander Thorne made sure of it. He carried the lesson forward with deliberate intent. Every new officer who arrived at Havenwood sat through an orientation unlike any other. They were shown the file of Chief Warrant Officer Eva Rostova, redacted where necessary, but clear enough to tell the truth. Then they were shown Vance's public apology, recorded on video, his voice trembling, his pride in pieces. The message was simple, clear, uncompromising. Here, respect is not granted by rank, it is earned by competence. Here, you will listen. Here, you will not make the same mistake. The lesson worked. The arrogance that often festered between ranks began to erode. In its place came something else, a symbiosis, a recognition that the military wasn't sustained by bars or stars alone, but by the quiet backbone of those who wore neither. The change was real, tangible. The officers' club itself was no longer just an officers' club. On Friday nights, it was common to see a young lieutenant sharing a table with a grizzled sergeant major, sketching out a plan on a napkin. Equals in purpose, if not in rank. It wasn't utopia. Friction remained, pride still surfaced, but the tone had shifted. And at the center of it all was a woman who refused to see herself as the center at all. Eva Rostova had become a ghost even while alive. Her presence in the hangar, her quiet focus, was proof enough. She didn't cultivate her legend. She didn't even acknowledge it. But legends don't need their subjects' permission. They live on their own. And at Havenwood, the legend of Rostova was no longer a rumor. It was an institution. How does one woman's keystrokes become part of history? The Ghost Hawk lay in the marshland, its fuselage twisted but intact, its classified cargo untouched. To most on base, it was just wreckage, a problem for engineers and investigators. But to the highest levels, it was something else. The flight data was pulled within hours, analyzed, cross-examined, sent up the chain of command faster than routine protocol allowed, because hidden inside those black boxes was something no one had expected. Those few seconds of improvised code. Lines written not in a laboratory, not in a research center, but in a corner of an officers' club by a warrant officer whose name most in Washington had never heard. The analysts stared at it, ran simulations, compared it to their own best attempts. And what they found unsettled them. Her solution had been elegant, brutal in its efficiency, a fusion of human intuition and machine logic that engineering teams had theorized about but never successfully implemented. She had done it alone, with seconds to spare. They gave it a name: the Rostova maneuver. From that day forward, it wasn't just an improvisation. It became a protocol, built into every advanced drone, every next-generation airframe. An emergency fallback written into the code of machines not yet even built. Her hands, steady that night as she typed, would steady thousands of machines in skis she would never see. It wasn't a medal, it wasn't a statue, it was something quieter, something deeper. Her competence had been etched into the invisible DNA of aviation. Back at Havenwood, the effect was slower but just as profound. The phrase "don't pull a Vance" had already entered the vocabulary, but now it was more than a warning. It was shorthand for a culture shift, a reminder that arrogance could blind but humility could save. Lieutenants stopped speaking first in meetings. Some started asking questions instead of issuing orders. Commanders took longer to listen before dismissing suggestions. Change is often slow in military culture. Tradition weighs heavy. Hierarchy resists, but this was different. This wasn't a policy shift handed down from above. It was a story. And stories have a way of sinking deeper than regulations ever could. In the hangars, mechanics joked, "Careful, do Vance this one," when a new pilot assumed too much. The pilots didn't bristle. They nodded, reminded of the cost of blindness. In the barracks, recruits whispered the legend of the quiet warrant officer who had bent a drone's fall like gravity itself. And on Friday nights at the officers' club, the tables looked different. Captains and master sergeants sat shoulder to shoulder, sketching tactics on napkins. Lieutenants leaned forward to listen when a warrant officer spoke. For Eva Rostova, none of this mattered. She never sought the story. She never asked to be remembered. She stayed in the hangar, sleeves rolled, hands stained with grease, her voice calm and steady as she pointed out fractures and wiring faults to young airmen. To her, the applause was irrelevant. The lesson was in the work itself. But Commander Thorne knew better. He made the story part of the institution. Every new officer arriving at Havenwood was sat down in a classroom. They were shown her file, the hours, the decorations, the projects that bore her fingerprints, and then they were shown the video of Vance's apology. Not as humiliation, as instruction. The message was clear. Here, respect is not defined by rank alone. Here, you will listen. Here, you will not repeat the same mistake. And the effect grew. It reached beyond Havenwood, carried by officers transferring to new commands, carried by pilots at other bases, carried by engineers working on aircraft she had touched. The legend traveled farther than she did. Because Eva Rostova herself did not stay. Her kind of expertise was too rare, too valuable. She was reassigned, quietly, without fanfare, moved like a queen on a chessboard to wherever the nation's most critical problems demanded her. One day she was there in the hangar, pointing out torque patterns to a mechanic. The next, she was gone. No one asked where. No one needed to. Her absence only deepened her presence. Because by then, her story had already become something larger than her. Lieutenant Vance, now first lieutenant, lived in that shadow too, but unlike before, it no longer crushed him. It guided him. The arrogance was gone, burned away in the fire of his public reckoning. In its place was something quieter, humility, patience. He was seen differently now. Not as the young officer who once mocked, but as the one who had been broken and rebuilt. He was found listening more than he spoke, asking before he judged, pausing before he dismissed. He would never be able to erase the night of the club, but in time, that didn't matter. Because the story of that night was no longer about his failure. It was about her strength. And that was the story people wanted to tell. In the Pentagon, analysts still reviewed her code, marveling at its elegance. In the skis, pilots trained on maneuvers that bore her name, and on the ground, young officers whispered reminders not to mistake silence for weakness. Her legacy had woven itself into the institution in a way no medal ever could. Invisible, indelible. And in quiet corners of Havenwood, when the marshland glistened under the morning sun, pilots dipping their wings in salute knew the truth. One night, one woman had bent not just the fall of a drone. She had bent the culture of an entire service. And she had done it without ever raising her voice. How long does it take for a moment to become a myth? A year had passed since the night of the officers' club. The champagne laughter, the red alarms, the impossible descent of the ghost hawk, they were no longer fresh wounds. They were history. But history has a way of settling into the bones of a place. At Havenwood, the story of Chief Warrant Officer 5 Eva Rostova was no longer whispered like gossip. It was told like scripture. Commander Thorne had made certain of it. Every newly commissioned officer who arrived at the base was required to sit in a classroom before they ever stepped foot on the flight line. They were shown her record. They were shown her file, stripped of its redactions by Thorne's own authority. Hours logged that defied comprehension. Decorations that read like the ribbon rack of a general. Missions marked, classified, but whispered about in tones of awe. And then, after the facts, came the warning. The video of Lieutenant Derek Vance, standing at a podium under the merciless sun, his voice trembling as he read his apology aloud to thousands. The silence after his words, the weight of it, the humiliation turned into instruction. The message to the young officers was simple, clear, uncompromising. Here, respect is not a function of your bars. Here, you will listen to your warrant officers and your NCOs. Here, you will not mistake stillness for weakness. The room always went quiet after the video ended, not out of discipline, out of understanding. The lesson landed harder than any regulation ever could. And so, in a single year, Havenwood changed. The culture shifted, not overnight but steadily, like a compass correcting itself. Where once the officers' club had been a walled garden, it became something else. On Friday nights, young lieutenants sat shoulder to shoulder with master sergeants. A captain could be found sketching tactics on a napkin across from a warrant officer who had spent more time in the sky than he'd spent on the ground. The arrogance didn't vanish entirely. Pride is stubborn, but it softened, it bent, it learned to listen. And the phrase, "don't pull a Vance," became more than a joke. It became policy in practice, a cultural warning label, a reminder not to repeat the mistake that had scarred one man and reshaped them all. For Derek Vance himself, the year had been a crucible. The boy who had strutted through the officers' club with champagne on his breath and mockery on his lips was gone. What stood in his place was a man in the making. He was no longer loud, no longer quick to judge. His arrogance had been burned away in the fire of humiliation. He had been seen in the motor pool, shoulders bent beneath the hood of an armored vehicle, listening as a gunnery sergeant showed him how to spot a transmission leak. He had been seen in the comms shop, leaning close as a warrant officer explained the intricacies of a satellite uplink. He asked questions now. He admitted when he didn't know. It wasn't easy. Humility never is, but it was real. And the men and women who had once dismissed him began, slowly, to respect him. Not because of his bars, not because of his apologies, but because he had changed his posture. He had learned to listen. They started to say something new about him. He's different now. He listens, he cares, he's learning. That kind of respect, once earned, is heavier than any title. He still thought of her, of the night she had dismantled him without ever speaking a word, of the silence that had cut sharper than any insult. And though he never said it aloud, he carried her lesson into every decision he made. Meanwhile, Eva Rostova was gone. She had left Havenwood as quietly as she had lived there, reassigned, moved to another board, another problem, another piece of the military machine only a handful of people could ever even name. Her absence was sharp, felt in the hangars, in the barracks, in the officers' club where her silence had once stood heavier than any voice. And yet her presence remained. Not in person, but in practice. In the way officers treated their NCOs. In the way lieutenants paused before they spoke. In the way pilots dipped their wings over the marshland where the Ghost Hawk had fallen, christened unofficially as Rostova's Point. She had become a ghost. Not the kind that haunts, the kind that guides. And at Havenwood she was everywhere. The story was told not as entertainment but as obligation, a parable every soldier carried with them. In the hangar, an old master sergeant taught recruits how to strip a turbine and ended the lesson with, "Remember, respect the quiet ones. They might save your life someday." In the barracks, squad leaders told the tale in the hush of night. "Don't mistake the rank chart for reality. The world is deeper than that. Remember Rostova." And in Washington, the Rostova maneuver had already been written into doctrine, folded into training modules for pilots who had never met her and never would. Her name became shorthand not just for competence, but for the invisible power of knowledge and humility. Back at Havenwood, life went on. Aircraft launched, crews rotated, missions came and went. But something lingered, something different. And if you listened closely on quiet nights, when the hangars were still and the marshland glistened under moonlight, you could hear it in the air. A story carried like wind. A story of one night when silence spoke louder than arrogance. A story of a woman who outranked them all, not with bars or stars, but with competence. And though she was gone, the base she left behind was not the same. It had been bent, reforged, remade in her image. Not by order, not by decree, but by example. The quietest, strongest example of all. How do you carry the weight of a ghost you never see again? For Derek Vance, that question became his every day. It had been more than a year since the night of the officers' club. More than a year since the humiliation, the apology, the silence that had broken him and rebuilt him. And though Eva Rostova had long since vanished into the classified currents of the military machine, she remained the constant presence in his mind. He no longer thought of her as the woman who embarrassed him. He thought of her as the woman who saved him. Not with kindness, not with comfort, but with truth. With the raw, unrelenting truth of competence that had shown him the smallness of his arrogance and left him no choice but to grow. And grow he did. He learned to keep his voice quieter in meetings, learned to let silence breathe before he spoke, learned that respect was not commanded but earned every day in every interaction. When younger lieutenants arrived at Havenwood, brimming with the same kind of brittle pride he once wore like armor, they looked to him for cues. They expected swagger, orders, confidence that drowned out doubt. Instead, they found him listening, found him asking the sergeant major what he thought, found him deferring to a warrant officer's experience before making decisions. It unsettled them at first, but then slowly it taught them. Because if the man once synonymous with arrogance could bow his head and listen, then maybe they should too. The story of "Don't Pull a Vance" still lingered in the air, but now it carried a different weight. It was less mockery, more reminder. Less about his failure, more about what failure had made of him. He became known not as the officer who once sneered, but as the one who had learned the hardest way possible. And quietly, without fanfare, he began to earn respect. Not for his title, not for his bar, for his humility. But while Vance walked his path of redemption, Eva Rostova's absence deepened her legend. She was gone from Havenwood, reassigned to missions and projects no one spoke about. And yet, her name remained as heavy as ever. Pilots still dipped their wings over Rostova's point. Mechanics still repeated her story to recruits. Commanders still showed her file to new officers during in-processing. She had become a ghost who shaped reality without ever needing to return. The Pentagon still studied her code. The Rostova maneuver became embedded doctrine, drilled into pilots who never knew the name belonged to a living woman. In classrooms across the service, instructors taught the maneuver with reverence, as though it had always existed. Most never knew it had been born in an officers' club, typed in calm keystrokes by a woman everyone underestimated. Her anonymity was her shield and her power. At Havenwood, that anonymity became a culture. The lines between rank and wisdom blurred more than ever before. Lieutenants stopped treating sergeants like background noise. Captains paused before dismissing a warrant officer's warning. Majors leaned in closer when the quietest person in the room finally chose to speak. The story had not just changed Vance, it had changed the air itself. And yet, for all the reverence, for all the lessons, for all the whispered warnings, no one ever quite understood her. She remained an enigma, a face glimpsed in memory, a posture of stillness that haunted their imaginations. To the men and women of Havenwood, she had become something beyond human. She was no longer just a person. She was principle embodied. The quiet professional. And in some ways, that was the truest legacy. Because while medals tarnish, while names fade from rosters, while careers end in retirement, principles do not die. Her silence had taught them something deeper than orders or doctrine ever could. That true authority is not the medal on your collar, but the gravity of your character. And Vance carried that lesson most of all. He remembered the night he had tried to make her flinch, the way her eyes had looked through him, cold and empty, as though he wasn't even on her radar. At the time, it had infuriated him. Now he understood. That silence hadn't been dismissal, it had been truth. He hadn't mattered, not because he was beneath her, but because he was still blind, still trapped in the illusion that authority came from bars, from volume, from swagger. She had refused to meet him in that illusion. She had let him burn in his own arrogance until the fire consumed itself. And when the moment came, she had acted not to punish him, but to save everyone else. She had taught him the most brutal lesson a soldier can learn. That respect is not a right, it is a debt, earned through competence, paid in humility, collected in silence. As the year turned to 2, her story hardened into folklore. It became mandatory at Havenwood's orientations. It traveled to other bases, told by officers who had once been lieutenants in the room. It seeped into the bones of the service, untraceable in its origin, unstoppable in its spread. And in Washington, her name surfaced in hushed tones, attached to projects no one else dared speak of, to aircraft not yet built, to missions that officially didn't exist. The legend of Eva Rostova had become twofold. At Havenwood, she was the parable of humility. In the Pentagon, she was the ghost in the machine. And in both places, she was untouchable. Vance knew he would likely never see her again. He accepted that. But he also knew that everything he did from then on would be shaped by her absence. Every decision, every word, every silence. Because some ghosts don't need to be present to lead you. They live in the choices you make. And Eva Rostova, the woman he once tried to humiliate, had become his compass. What happens to a story when the people in it are gone? Years passed, seasons turned, faces rotated in and out of Havenwood, lieutenants became captains, captains became majors, sergeants retired, their names etched into plaques no one read after a decade. New recruits filled bunks where old ones had slept. But some things didn't fade. Some things lingered, like the echo of a voice long after it stopped speaking. The night of the officers' club had hardened into folklore. It was no longer just a memory of those who had stood there under champagne light and red alarms. It was now a parable, institutionalized, retold in classrooms, whispered in hangars, passed along in barracks. It wasn't exaggerated. It didn't need to be. The truth was enough. The woman who had been mocked as a technician had saved a town. The lieutenant who mocked her had been humbled, and a commander had saluted her in a way that rewrote the hierarchy of the room forever. At Havenwood, every new officer still sat through the story as part of their in-processing. They still saw her record projected onto the wall. They still watched Vance's apology, his voice trembling as he admitted his arrogance. And every time the silence afterward was the same, heavy, reflective, transformative. They didn't leave the room with laughter in their mouths. They left with the understanding that the quietest voice in a room might be the one holding everything together. Across the service, her influence spread further still. The Rostova maneuver became canon, a protocol embedded in systems she would never touch, saving lives she would never know. Pilots rehearsed it without knowing its origin. Engineers programmed it into aircraft as if it had always been there. Her fingerprints were invisible, but they were everywhere. And for Derek Vance, now older, his arrogance long burned away, her ghost remained his compass. He had risen, not quickly, but steadily. His reputation was no longer the brittle shine of ceremony, but the quiet respect of those who served under him. People described him differently now, not as sharp, not as loud, not as commanding in presence, but as reliable, steady, humble. The kind of officer who paused to listen, the kind who asked his NCOs before giving an order, the kind who earned respect not with volume but with patience. He carried his mistake like a scar, not to be hidden but to be remembered. Because scars, when worn honestly, can guide more than medals ever could. And though he never saw Eva Rostova again, he didn't need to. She had left him the only thing that mattered, a lesson that reshaped not only him, but the air he breathed. For her part, she was never interested in legend. She was reassigned from one crisis to another, solving problems most would never hear of. Her expertise was a national asset, moved like a queen on a chessboard where most only ever saw pawns. No one knew where she went, few ever asked. But her presence remained, in whispers, in gestures, in the way pilots dipped their wings over Rostova's Point, the marshland where a drone had once come down without fire or death. In the Pentagon, her name was still spoken in hushed tones in classified briefings. But to most, she had dissolved into myth. And perhaps that was how she preferred it. Because Eva Rostova never sought applause, never chased recognition, never claimed titles as her identity. She was not a story to herself. She was simply a professional. Her focus was always on the work, on the problem in front of her, on the endless pursuit of excellence that required no witness. But stories do not belong to their subjects. They belong to those who carry them. And her story carried on. In the hangars, an old master sergeant still told recruits, "Respect the quiet ones. They've seen more than you. They'll save you when it counts." In the barracks, squad leaders still whispered to new soldiers, "Don't mistake the rank chart for truth. Reality runs deeper. Remember Rostova." And in the officers' clubs of far-off bases, her name still rose like a ghost. "Did you hear about the woman at Havenwood, the one the commander saluted?" Every retelling changed details as stories do, but the core never shifted. Silent competence, respect. That was her legacy. Not medals, not statues, not ceremonies. A culture reshaped. A generation taught humility. An entire doctrine shifted because one woman had refused to flinch. And so, when the question was asked, what is the true measure of a soldier? The answer no longer came from textbooks or flowcharts. It came from the story of a quiet woman who had once been dismissed, ignored, insulted, and who had then outranked them all without needing to say a word. And that story lived on. It lived in the way officers paused before speaking, in the way young lieutenants checked their pride at the door, in the way warrant officers held their heads higher, their quiet authority recognized at last. Her story lived because it wasn't about her. It was about what she represented. That competence is its own rank. That character is its own commission. That silence can speak louder than arrogance. And that sometimes the strongest authority is not the one you hear. It's the one you feel in the gravity of a steady hand, a calm breath, a woman who refuses to flinch. At Havenwood, her absence was eternal, but her presence was permanent. Because true strength doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand. It simply acts. And in acting, it becomes immortal.